Alrighty, so huge news. Force Throw has been suspended. FFG made the announcement. This will go into effect on September 22nd, which means if you have any last events coming up, it's your last chance to play with this card, but it's going to significantly alter the landscape of Star Wars Unlimited Premier play, and this video is going to be all about that. I'm going to dive right in. Before we get going, please hit that subscribe button. And if you're interested in some more content from me, including a bunch of deck updates, which I'm going to have to get to as soon as possible in this post-Force Throw world, then check out my Patreon as well. All right, so what am I going to review? First of all, I'm going to talk about Force Throw, why I think it was banned. Well, they announced that too, but why I think it should have been banned and kind of give you a little bit of commentary there. I'm going to talk about some other format pillars that are here to stay, and then we'll get into the decks. I'll first cover the decks playing Force Throw and what I think we can do with them, if anything. Then I'm going to cover the meta decks in the current environment that we're not playing Force Throw and whether or not I think they improve. And then finally, kind of the more exciting part, what are the decks that might have room to contend now that this card is gone? But let's go into this. Force Throw. It's gone. What was the problem? So I want to start, first of all, address format diversity. Now, the format technically was diverse if all you're looking at right now is the leaders that were making like top 8s or winning events. In fact, we do see quite a few different leaders represented right now. But I want to address the idea that format diversity means that the format is healthy. I do not think those two things are the same, and it is usually the argument I see for why Force Throw is good for the game. It's because it's making the format diverse, and I don't think that those two things should be equated. There can certainly be good formats that are diverse and have tons of leaders, but there can also be bad ones. And I do think this was a bad format currently. In fact, this was probably the format I have least enjoyed since the game has come out. And I'll talk a little bit about why that is. But that's kind of one element of this I wanted to address. That a lot of leaders winning does not mean the format is good or healthy. It's the manner of which gameplay happens and why these leaders are winning that would maybe determine if a format is healthy. And more narrow formats like 5-deck formats or 6-deck formats, whatever it may be, whatever arbitrary number we want to give it, those can actually be really good formats. It gives competitive players an angle to attack. Whether or not it's with a non-off-meta deck, they kind of know what they need to prepare for, or whether or not they want to play one of the main contenders. There's sort of like an umbrella of decks they know they need to address. And right now, there are a ton of different leaders present. So it is sometimes very difficult to actually metagame in a tournament. Whether or not you think that's good or bad, you know, that's up to you. I don't love that. And the other thing is, all these decks, I don't think it's actually that diverse. Force Throw decks made up about 50% of the winners bracket, which means event winners or event top 8s. That's kind of what I looked at number-wise. Now, you can tell me that all the Force Throw decks play differently, and they do, in a sense. They are different decks, right? Quinlan and Kylo Tarkintown are not the same deck. Han 2 and Anakin and Yoda are like flavors of a similar deck, not exactly the same. Talzin is not the same deck, but mostly they're winning because of this card. They are Force Throw decks. That's what the decks are. They are not something else. They are first a Force Throw deck, then they do other things. And to me, it's not really diverse. If half the field is winning because of this card, that doesn't feel that diverse to me. And then if you look at the other half of the field that's not playing it, it was split between mostly a few things. Sabine ECL, a deck that's existed since the dawn of time. Cad Tarkintown, which we'll talk about a bit later. And pilot decks. The most popular and winningest one was Boba. And pilot decks are decks entirely built on ignoring their opponent, for the most part. I describe them a little bit like solitaire decks. They are entering an arena of the game, the space arena, that was kind of built as the secondary arena up until Jump to Lightspeed, which really unlocked the space arena. They are ignoring the main arena of the game, which is the ground arena. That's where most cards are. That's where most leaders are. And basically asking you, do you have the right interaction in your deck, and are you drawing it at the right time? Because they tend to invalidate a whole bunch of cards in the decks they play against. They lead to kind of non-games a lot of the time because of this, right? Did I draw my few space openers? Did I draw my Bamboozle or Rival's Fall? Things like that, where you get like really swingy gameplay, regardless of which side you're on. But I believe a lot of these pilot decks became more popular because it was kind of a fool's errand to try to engage in a ground game if you weren't playing red with Force Throw. Almost every single deck, barring the couple I mentioned, the CAD and the Sabine, are Force Throw decks. That's simply what is happening right now, that basically every deck that plays to the ground and wins is playing Force Throw. So, yeah. Is it really diverse? I don't know. If you look at leaders, yes. If you look at actual gameplay, I would argue it wasn't actually that diverse. Like I said, over 50% of the decks were playing this, or right around there. It changes week by week. Other problems with Force Throw. It became essentially free to enable. This card was designed around a restriction, which was having a Force unit in play. And if you look at sets 1 through 4, that meant a lot. Most Force units, especially early in the curve, absolutely sucked. They were largely unplayable units. And the Force Throw deck that was good starting in like set 3 and into set 4 was Quinlan. And it could not really enable this card until its flip turn, or sometimes like with Ahsoka a turn before. So there was a true cost to building around this card. Similar to how like Triple Dark Raid wasn't broken until the vehicle set came out and then all the broken vehicles. It's a very similar thing here. Force Throw was designed to be very powerful to reward you for playing underrate units or building your whole deck around a leader that is Force. So like, or in the first set that was like Churrick. He was like probably the best Force Throw deck. It wasn't like a top deck, but you had to like really strive and work to like include this card in your deck. That is gone. Force Throw is basically free to enable. In fact, some of the earliest units you play in the game and the best ones are Force units, right? We've seen the power curve shift in the early game. Things like Yaddle, Adigalia, Gunji, Obi-Wan, Ezra. Like, these cards are all Force units. They're all better than most other units you play early in the curve. So Force Throw was free to enable, and thus its power substantially increased because it no longer forced you to be playing weaker cards. What else? Force Throw leads to incredibly swingy games and non-games. You draw a couple of these cards early in the game. There was no reason to even play the game in the first place. It doesn't promote interactive gameplay. It's just draw dependent. The card is way too cheap. It fits way too easily into curves and does way too much for one resource. And because it's now no longer a difficult thing to enable, it's basically impossible for your opponent to actually shut this down because you just have Force units up and down the curve. It's just swingy, right? Like, think of those games you win because you draw more Force Throws than your opponent. It's a lot. And like I said, all those decks playing Force Throw, over 50% of the meta, or right around 50% of the meta, they're winning because of this card. And I don't think that's great. I just don't think that's good for a game that wants to be balanced. Force Throw decreases player agency and skill expression. I stand by this. I think it makes games less skillful, more draw dependent. It goes into the swingy nature of it. Just a lot more variance based on when you draw this card, how many of this card you draw. Very different than other powerful cards because of how cheap it is, because of how broken it is when you play this on like turn 1 or turn 2 and early in the game when your opponent doesn't have a lot of time to manage their hand, where they have low health units in play that get easily 2-for-1'd by this, right? Just too good. It completely dominates ground strategies. Like I said, I think a lot of the reason we see so many pilot decks pop up is because if anyone wants to compete with these ground decks without playing Force Throw, they basically can't on the ground, so they have to go into space. This completely crushed. This is entirely what ground warfare was is built around right now. There's largely nothing else you can play if you want to play like a ground mid-range or even like an aggressive slanted deck without abusing maybe a couple other things, which I will talk about in a moment. But yeah, it's the main dominating force there. Too much for too little. I think I covered that. And then lastly, and I think more honestly the most important, and I think we get caught up a lot in like, oh, is the format balanced? We shouldn't touch it. We shouldn't mess with it. It's diverse. There's lots of leaders. Is it fun though? Like, is this card actually any fun for anyone? I don't enjoy playing this card. I just feel like I'm cheating sometimes or like winning on turn 2. I certainly don't like flipping my leader and getting it one shot for one resource. I certainly don't like on turn 2 getting double force thrown and just conceding the game on the spot because there's no reason to play it anymore. I don't think this is fun. Forget the fact that maybe it's balanced. Maybe it is balanced. I don't know. I don't think so. I think maybe a lot of matchups are technically balanced, but the individual games aren't because they're so swingy. That part is secondary. For me, this wasn't fun to participate in. It really drained my energy to play. And, I'm one person. You don't have to feel this way. Trust me. Like, no offense if you think that this was a poor decision. But I just want to explain why I think it was a good one, why I think the game will improve now. And, this format up until set 6, it's only going to last about a month and a half. So we're getting like new life injected into the game right now. You get to like mess with new decks, play them for a month. Spoiler season's already underway for set 6. By the middle of October, we might have close to the full set for set 6. You're not enjoying this new format without Force Throw? Bam. Start playing with the new set soon after, and this will all be forgotten soon enough anyway. All right, let's talk about a few other pillars, a few other cards I've seen mentioned as like, standouts, things that are maybe oppressive, and Tarkhan Town is probably next up on the list. Now, the reason I don't think this was touched is because two of the 3 main Tarkhan Town decks, Quinlan and Kylo, just got obliterated by the Force Throw ban. You can say maybe those decks don't disappear entirely, maybe, but they're so heavily crushed in their power level that maybe it doesn't matter that much. Cad Bane is really the untouched one. I did mention that like Cad Bane and Sabine, and we'll get to ECL in a second, are kind of the 2 ground decks that were already doing well in a Force Throw world, so to speak, and might actually increase in popularity depending on what other decks start to pop back into the game now that Force Throw is gone. And I'm not sure Cad or Sabine are going to become oppressive just because Force Throw is gone. I think there's plenty of decks that kind of come out of the woodworks now to challenge a lot of existing decks and those decks that couldn't thrive in a world where Force Throw existed. Another one is Data Vault. Now this one's like a really weird one to comment on because it doesn't like innately make a deck like stand out. Like the power level is sort of hidden in this, but Data Vault is of course a popular one. It's not the most seen base right now. I think Tarkhan Town easily is, but a lot of decks can run this. We might even see some new decks come into the game now running this, decks of old that existed but or even exist right now in small numbers but aren't putting up tons of results. So the 3 bases, the 3 main rare bases with high power levels are certainly pillars. And then the other one here is Timely Darth Vader, and you can say ECL and Darth Vader. But this is an incredibly, incredibly powerful interaction. And I think in large part, this interaction was being kept in check by grindy red Force decks, specifically like the hero ones like Han and Anakin. Now, you can look at decks like Kira, which are getting absolutely crushed by those archetypes, and that isn't putting up results. Well, they can include this card. And there's certainly other combinations, whether it's Gar Saxon, Iden, Kylo Green. Like a lot of decks can include this combination, and they may now pop up a little bit. So I do consider that a bit of a format pillar just because of how powerful that interaction is. All right. What do we do with the Force Throw decks? These are the 6 main ones that all lose this card. And first up, these decks get significantly worse. So much worse. They're losing the best card in the game, their best card. The card that's probably most responsible for winning games is gone. So can some of these decks survive? Maybe. I'd say Quinlan, probably not. Talzin, probably not. Kylo, better chance than the other two, but also probably not. It's a main reason it's able to even establish board control early in the game. If not, I think it could get run over by a lot of different decks. Now, worth trying. And if you really like these decks, I'm not saying don't run them. Just because a deck gets knocked down a peg doesn't mean it can't still win. But I'm here just to like give you my opinion on like the power level overall at the top tier of competitive play. And likely these decks can't truly survive without that card. Not nearly, at least compared to like how they're doing right now. And if the whole power level of the if the power level of the format all decreases substantially because Force Throw is gone, then maybe these decks can still exist. But because there are so many decks that weren't running Force Throw that still are around, like think about playing these matchups now. Like any like Quinlan and Talzin, Kylo playing against Boba, Data Vault, or Vader, or Sabine. Like these decks that weren't playing Force Throw, where Force Throw was probably your best card against them, and now you just don't have access to it anymore. It is, of course, going to affect them. Now we can look at the other side here, which is the Hero Red Force decks. Which of these can kind of exist? I'd say the one that has the best chance of kind of surviving and still in a dominant form is Han. Because Han abuses a lot of other interactions outside of Force Throw, right? Things like Kiadi, Itinerant Warrior, Mace, all ahead of curve. Things like Octo Bogdo and Grogu. These are all cards that are just so much better in Han than they are in these other red Force decks. So I think Han, because he innately cheats in other ways, not just with Force Throw, has the best chance. Anakin probably has the second best chance. It does lose a lot of its top end power, but it also has kind of a cheaty hero leader ability. You know, there's a chance, I would say, first instinct is probably no, at least not as like a tier 1 or tier 1.5, whatever arbitrary number we like giving decks, but maybe. And Yoda, I think probably not. Yoda really needed extra power boosts in the earlier game to kind of get it to that late game. I think it probably gets hit harder than Han or Anakin with that Force Throw. Man, it also was probably still a little fringier than the other two in terms of top play, although it has recently been putting up even more results. But all three of them, of course, get much weaker. We'll see if any of them can still survive as top tier decks. Overall, my instinct is none of these decks are going to be anywhere near as good as they used to be. Whether or not that means they're gone completely from the meta or just like relegated to like the outskirts, time will tell. I do not have all the knowledge. I will, of course, need to like test and see like, can these decks kind of function as different style decks? Maybe they move into other colors, of course. But yeah, Force Throw decks heavily nerfed. They've all lost their best card, right? The most broken card. So not a lot of decks usually can survive losing their best card. All right, next up, we'll talk about the current non-Force Throw meta decks. And my cutoff here was 5% of the top 8 meta share. And these are the 3 non-Force Throw decks that hit that number. There are some that were like in the 3%, 2%. Those are fringe decks, in my opinion. So these are the ones that kind of don't get touched by this ban. Where do they stand? So Boba, Pilot, you know, a lot of the Force Throw decks were competing with Boba because of Force Throw. The question is, what is going to happen in the rest of the meta? And will they be able to adapt to Boba, who has clearly been the most performing non-Force Throw deck, right? Do we start seeing like blue-green hero mid-range come back? Potentially, I do think so. And how are those decks against Boba, right? A lot of restore on the ground, usually a lot of high health units, things like that. Do we see villainous control decks be able to kind of move away from so much of this like ground-based interaction because of all these Force decks, and they can move more into like space interaction or things like that? Can they get better into Boba? What about the Han 1? He's notoriously pretty good against space decks because he gets to play like these Falcons early, And, you know, he's got pilots and he comes out early, can put a lot of pressure. So, yeah, like maybe Boba doesn't actually get better with this ban, even though at first instinct it might be to say he does. Cad Bane, kind of the surviving Tarkin Town deck. What happens here, right? He's still really good, and, you know, a lot of its players are now playing like the one drop spam version, which really puts your opponent in the bind in the early turn because they can't really play around Tarkin Town anymore. But again, what about these blue-green decks? What about Kira, for instance? What about Han? Like, how do these decks play? Can those decks be built to beat Cad? It's gonna take time. Like, I don't have the answer for you. I'm just explaining why. Just because a deck was good and didn't get affected by a ban, it doesn't mean it automatically becomes like a menace and like the most broken deck, right? We don't know if Boba or Cad or even Sabine here, which is like ever lurking, are going to be like the best deck in game now that Force Throw is gone. They might just have to adapt to newcomers that are going to push their way into the Force Throw list meta. All right, let's talk about the looking to contend. So these are like decks that are not performing that well right now, that are on the rise, and no question about it, Han 1 is going to be the first one to look at because all these Force Throw decks were really preventing him from appearing in a lot of metas, right? He's the leader that is probably most hurt by getting one shot. So much of the power level of this leader comes from its ability to do that 5 to 7 flip turn, and you resource and flip your leader and he gets one shot by a one resource card. Sometimes just lose on the spot. It's also a deck that plays with a low hand count because of its ability, and it's another way that it gets punished by Force Throw. So this deck can certainly come back, and I think it likely will. Green is probably my first instinct. You get a lot of like late game grinding ability with like Kelleran and Ewing and, you know, of course, like Han and Enfys and whatever other 7s you want to play, while also being able to put pressure, have things like Chewbacca in the deck. But I think there's ways to build this differently, like with an aggro mono yellow style, even with blue to enable the Anakin 6-drop with villainous cards that you can easily enable with this leader. It is the biggest riser for me, and a lot of work to be done building decks for Han. Next up, Vader decks, and I did mention Timely Vader as a format pillar, and, you know, none of these decks have been performing that well. Kira, a favorite of mine, was not well positioned. Kylo Green, also relegated to Fringe. Gar and Iden. Iden probably the most different of these because that's almost always built as a pure hard control deck. But even then, it was often playing Timely and Vader in its like hard control shell. But whatever it is, these decks, I call them Vader decks. They are really going to try to abuse that Timely Vader. I think ECL can factor in some builds of these, although I think Data Vault is usually going to be the better in most cases. But whatever it is, are they back? Is Kira back? I think Kira was getting hurt the most by these Hero Red Force decks, and they're not necessarily going to be gone. Like Han 2 still gets to do the Kiadi thing, which is probably a bigger deal for Kira than Force Throw was, but if the power level of that deck comes down a bit, Kira might be able to compete a little more, might be able to adapt to the space decks a little more than she normally does because of so much space in the deck being used for the ground warfare. Kylo Green, can he kind of replace Kylo Red as the prominent, version of Kylo? Maybe. And maybe people also move a little bit away from sideboard tech against Kylo Red, which of course also hits Kylo Green. Gar is usually the most aggressive of these versions, doesn't always play like a pure control shell. It plays like more aggro mid-range, but it still relies a lot on like Vader a lot of the time. And then Iden can hard control. Like, I don't think Force Throw is necessarily what was keeping Iden in check. I think Quinlan was one of her worst matchups, and Quinlan might be gone from the meta, but it might be replaced by more Sabine or more Han or whatever it may be. So it doesn't necessarily mean she's going to become dominant, but these are all decks that you need to start considering and going to be working on figuring out which Vader Timely or Vader ECL deck fights the best right now. Next up, Blue-Green Hero, and this was basically a forgotten archetype because, again, you were trying to play a ground-based mid-range deck, and you were just getting crushed by Force Throw and Ki-Adi-Mundi. But now one of those is gone, the more dangerous one for these decks. You're going to potentially be able to establish early board. So Ray Data Vault, huge riser in my mind. And that deck can certainly function pretty well against like space decks a lot of time if built appropriately. OB1, he's been mostly gone from the meta entirely, but like a blue-green Force deck, like can we all of a sudden play Force without relying on red? Possibly now, because it's no longer just getting ultra dominated by Force Throw. So you can do Ray as well with green Force. I think Obi, if you're going to do Force, might lean a little better because, you know, he gets to do the ability for free. But certainly that's a riser. Can you look at Yoda with green? That might be an option as well. I think blue-green hero is a big riser, and these are going to be like grindy mid-range decks usually. Obi, in fact, can be played with other colors like yellow as well as a more aggro deck that now doesn't get ultra punished all the time by Force Throw either. So these are cool things to look at, and you know, I said Obi yellow. You could try red as well. Like there's all of a sudden maybe a way to move into that, although I do think if you're going to play red Force, my first instinct will still be just to stay with Han 2. He seems the best suited to abuse the Force units in red. And then some other risers. So Vader, you might be surprised to see this here because you see him probably a lot at events, but he was performing incredibly poorly. In fact, he was one of the most played decks with one of the lowest conversion rates. This deck had like negative, if you look at like stat aggregating websites, had like negative win rates into basically every deck in the game. And Force Throw is obviously responsible for a lot of that. The card really punished Vader because of all the low health units it plays and the small hand count it usually keeps. So could he kind of like increase his win rate, right? I don't think he can increase his play rate. The deck was already getting played a ton. And what about all the other pilots? I just wrote pilots here, but like Kazuda, Luke, Han, Pilot. Like there's a lot of other pilot decks that could increase in play rate. And honestly, they're all kind of the same to me. Like they all have a very similar play pattern of try to ignore most of what your opponent is doing, make so much of their deck invalid against you, hope they don't have the right interaction at the right time for your deck. So they are a bucket for me of similar play styles with just different flavors, but they could all potentially be better now without Force Throw. And lastly, Palpatine here, who's recently also been doing decently well. He didn't reach the threshold I wanted for earlier, where I was like talking about the decks, the top decks that didn't get nerfed. But he's been around primarily as a yellow deck. He didn't get affected by the Force Throw. Now, Force Throw wasn't really that good against this deck because it draws tons of cards. It wasn't getting like ultra punished by Force Throw. Its leader didn't really care about it either. It's a 10 health unit. So I don't know exactly what happens with Palpatine. Does it get better or not? It was probably pretty good against a lot of the Force decks, especially like the hero mid-range Force decks. So it might actually lose some of its power because those decks are going to decrease in play rate. But, you know, he's worth looking at and adapting in this new world. And, of course, I put a question mark here because I don't know what else. There's going to be so much could happen. This is a very significant change. It's one card, but it's a very significant change. And a lot can happen that even I can't predict right now. So, time to get to work, right? All right. I know this is a little bit of a polarizing topic. Not everyone wanted this card banned. I did, but I'm one person. I am one person giving you one opinion. And you know, if it persuades you or you agree with it, let me know. If you're one of those that, you know, thinks this wasn't appropriate, I'd love to hear it too. Respectfully, of course. This is just, for me, kind of new life to the game right now. It was getting very stale. The individual games were getting kind of unfun to play for me. So I'm happy about this, but I understand that, you know, it's difficult when a deck you're playing, and maybe it's the only deck you have, gets significantly nerfed, and maybe you don't think it's powerful enough that can affect your desire to continue playing as well. So let me know what you think. Interested to hear it. And, you know, I'm going to be working on a lot of decks. I'll be posting things on Patreon, making new videos as well on YouTube. So if you have something you want to see, let me know. And until next time, take care.